Hanukkah,
which is one of the Zmanim, Chafei Kislev. It denotes, commemorates a specific event which happened many years ago, about 2,000 years ago, in 165 BCE. And the historical facts are essentially somewhat basic. By the Chub Ma'is Rishon, which took place in approximately 586 BCE, the first bias was destroyed by Babylonia, with its king Nebuchadnezzar. And Babylonia was a very short-lived kingdom. They had just destroyed, maybe 50 years earlier, the Assyrian kingdom, which also was very short-lived. And that itself is big hashkafas there also. But it's like these kingdoms only exist, something and then they go out of existence. But not long thereafter, Babylonia was conquered, the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians and the Medes. Cyrus specifically, and his children and so on. And the Medes created a kingdom that spread. It was the greatest kingdom the world has ever seen until that time. They went as far as India. That's how far the Persians went. Under one of the sons of Darius, I think Cambyses, they went literally as far as India, and they had their Malchus was all over the known world at that time. And that kingdom lasted about 200 years. But during that kingdom, the Jews had returned under Cyrus. They had turned back to Israel and they rebuilt the bias. The exile only lasted 70 years. The Babylonian exile only lasted 70 years, and they went back and built the Bias Sheni with Ezra and Nehemiah, and so on. And the Persian kingdom continued on a long time, for another 200 years or so. And then it was finally taken over by the Greeks, specifically the Yavon, under the military adventure of Alexander the Great, who conquered Persia. And Persia thereafter ceased to exist as an empire. He dismembered it and so on. And his kingdom survived for a long time. Alexander the Great himself died very young. He was 33 years old when he died. Amazing. He was 33 years old. He had conquered the world, all of Persia and most of the known world at that time. He died very young at 33, and his kingdom was split into a number of different parts. There were three sections. One section was the Egyptian section under the Ptolemies. That started the whole Ptolemaic dynasty. This was in the third century BCE, about in 320, 350 around that time. But one part of Alexander's empire was split under the Ptolemies. There was another one that was split under what's called the Seleucid dynasty under Antiochus. And then there was a third section that was retained also, but it was the area of Greece and so on. Now, we found ourselves now at this point in history under what's called the Seleucid dynasty, which were the Syrian Greeks, who were the inheritors of the Hellenistic civilization of Greece. And we come down to the year about 170, which is quite down the line. And Rome was beginning to emerge as a power. Rome had already had wars with Carthage, the Punic Wars, and Rome was emerging as a power. In fact, Rome was the main power that would destroy Greece. Rome would take over, and from them would go into the Roman kingdom itself. So basically what we see is a succession of various different kingdoms taking over the world at that time, one after the other, and the Jews, of course, interacting with each one of them. In Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah takes place in the third kingdom, which was Yavon, under the Seleucid dynasty of Antiochus, where Antiochus, in the Hebrew, took over. He was the Hellenistic ruler at that time, and he insisted that his Avodah Zarah and the Hellenistic culture should be implanted all over his kingdom to unify them, and he persecuted the Jews and insisted that they keep the Hellenistic tradition. And he took over Yerushalayim, and he took over the Beit HaMikdash, and he implanted Avodah Zarah in the Beit HaMikdash and so on, and he forced the Jews, he attempted to promote the Avodah Zarah, the whole Hellenistic tradition of Greece at that time, on the Jews, who of course refused. And after a while, there arose a Kohen Gadol, who's Matasyahu ben Yochanan, who was from the family of the Hashemnoim, and he arose at that time, and he rebelled. He killed a Jew who actually went ahead just to give in to the Avodah Zarah, and he killed one of the Greek governors and so on, and they rebelled. Him and his son Yehudis rebelled, and after 2 or 3 years they successfully destroyed the opposition to them, and they were successful in pushing back the forces of Antiochus and the Hellenistic rule of Yerushalayim, of Eretz Yisrael. And later on he continued to push back other enemies and so on. And when they came to Yerushalayim after the successful military defeat of the Greeks, and they came to Beit HaMikdash, it had been in ill repair for a long time, and they cleaned out the Beit HaMikdash and so on, and they came to the Heichel, they wanted to light the menorah. There's no oil, and they found only one pach, one container of oil, which was tahor still, it still had the seal, and they lit the menorah with that, but it was only enough for 1 day, but it lasted for 8 days, and this is the Nes of Hanukkah, and this is fundamentally what we celebrate, and so on. Then he went on later on, Yehudis went on to conquer other enemies and so on, and he gradually restored the kingdom, the Jewish monarchy at that time. But we're concerned with the Indian of Hanukkah at that time, in 165 BCE. Now, the truth of the matter is, when you look at the whole Indian of Hanukkah, you kind of say to yourself, what is really the chashivas of Hanukkah? What really happened over here? Basically, there were 2 events that really occurred in Hanukkah. The first event that occurred was the defeat of the Greeks at the hands of the Jews, and the dominion of the Jews over the Greeks, in the sense that they took back Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael and the Beit HaMikdash, and they threw out the Greeks. This was the first important event, and this was really the main event. The second event that we see in Hanukkah was the fact when they came to Beit HaMikdash and they only found 1 container of oil, it lasted for 8 days. This is the second event. Now the truth of the matter is, of the 2 events, it's the second one which is minor, even though that's the one that we really deal with in the menorah. How do we know it's minor? Because we see in the Siddur. The Siddur doesn't even mention, in Al Anisim, it doesn't even mention the Maisa of the nest, basically. If we read the Al Anisim, basically the English Al Anisim, Bala Fukim, Bala Gus, Bala Churus, Bala Neflos, Bala Nechomus, and so on. In the days of Matasyahu, Kohen Gadol, now you have to look at the Lashon here. When the Malchus, the Greek kingdom at that time, the Hellenistic tradition, they arose on Klal Yisrael, to make them forget the Torah, to see to it that the dust, that the Yahadus, the Torah mitzvahs, are removed from Klal Yisrael. And you, the Bonishom, in your Rachmonis, what did you do afterwards? You fought their struggles. Dantas dinam nokamto as mikmosom. Now, what happened? Mosato giborim biyad chaloshim. You gave the mighty in the hands of the weak. V'rabim biyad ma'atim, and the many, the numerous in the hands of the few. Utmeim biyad tahirim. Ushon biyad tzadikim. V'zedim biyad os v'sor sachar. And by doing this, it was a very big Kiddush Hashem. There was big issue of Klal Yisrael. And what happened? They came to the Beit HaMikdash. They cleaned up the Heichel. They were mitar the Beit HaMikdash. And then they lit the menorah, which was in the Kodesh. The Kovu Shmoinas Yomim Elu, Now there's no mention here. Basically, all it basically says is that they rekindled the menorah and that the Banishim did a nest, and that's it. There's no mention of what that nest was. So basically, the most of the mention of the Alanisim concerns itself with the Mechama, the fact that Klal Yisrael was Gova on the Soinim. But on the nest of Hanukkah itself, it doesn't really go into that much. Which means that the critical event of Hanukkah was the fact that the Jews were able to fight back against the oven and destroy the Greek influence on them, and again reinstate the Shlita of the Torah and Mitzvahs in Klal Yisrael. Now, there's a Klal Gadol in all the Mo'adim, and as I mentioned before, that every Chag which is given fundamentally is given for several different reasons. But basically, the inyan of Zman is the inyan of Hashpah or Shefa, in that every day or every week or every month there's a different Shefa on the Bria. And what it is that Chagim, the Chagim that we have, Pesach, Sukkot, and so on and so forth, and Shavuos, all of them are historical in their origin, in the sense that they all relate to some previous event. And the same thing is with Hanukkah and Purim. The critical aspect here is that, which we ask is that, if these things are previous events, why do we celebrate them now? Why are we involved with these inyanim in this day and age, when all these various chagim relate to things which happened a long time ago? And basically, what the Ramchal says clearly about this is that when these events happened a long time ago, what does it mean that these events happened? For example, the inyan of Pesach, the inyan of Yitzias Mitzrayim happened a long time ago. Why are we concerned with this now? We should more be concerned about the Gula Hasidah than the Gula Rishona. Why are we concerned with this now? So what the Ramchal says very, very clearly is that each one of these events which Klal Yisrael commemorates is not a historical event. Rather, what we're commemorating is a certain tikkun that was established in the world at that time. These events reflect certain tikkunim or certain madregas which Klal Yisrael reached at that point in time. And when Klal Yisrael reached a tikkun at that point in time, there was a certain shefa or awe that came down to the bria as a result of that tikkun. When we keep these chagim today, what we're fundamentally doing is attempting to in some way recapture that awe of that tikkun that existed then for today, and by doing that to be poil a similar kind of tikkun in the bria now. Now normally it would be impossible for us to do this. This sounds like an incredible zach. How can we take the awe of Yitzias Mitzrayim and the tikkun which was established then and establish it today? But this is what the Banishim did when he gave us the mitzvahs in the Chagim and the Mo'adim. What the Banishim basically said by the Mo'adim is that I will allow these Uris that once existed a long time ago to revisit the world every year. And by you being Shema, certain Velois essay and the essay that have to do with that specific Chag, you will in effect bring down the awe which is Shayach and which is connected with that particular event. And that awe that comes down is very similar to that original awe, and that it has in many similar ways a Pa'ula, even though you may not be able to see it. That's when Yidden keep they keep Pesach, Chag Pesach, they bring down the awe of a Gula, and that awe of a Gula is Poil, tremendous Yeshua's, even now, even though we cannot see it. It assists the Bria in coming closer to the Tikkun HaKlali, into the Gula Sida. The meaning of Hanukkah is also of a similar nature. When we keep Hanukkah, we're not observing something that was done 2,000 years ago, even though that's already what happened. What we're doing is we're trying to re-establish or recapture an awe which came down at that time, and that awe which came down at that time had to do with some kind of tikkun. So fundamentally, if we want to understand the meaning of Hanukkah, we have to really understand what the meaning of the tikkun was that established the world at that time. And obviously, by doing the mitzvah of the neros, by lighting the candles, one a day, or in our particular case, one the first day, two the second day, and so on, in a ascending order, we in some way are relating to that awe. The question is, what is that or, and how are we relating to the or to the Hadlokas Haneros? That's the question what we want to know. If you look at the Inyan of Hanukkah, the real matter is that Hanukkah is a much wider Inyan than seems to be the case. It would be a mistake simply to observe the historical events of what happened at Hanukkah only at that point in time. Why is that? Hanukkah basically represents an interface between Jews and Yovan, the Greeks. More specifically, the Greek proxies, in this case the Seleucid dynasty, who were the carriers of the Hellenistic tradition. But it was the Greek tradition and the Greek way of life which the Jews came into contact. What we know, and what the Gemara says, what we know is that since the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, Klal Yisrael has essentially been in captivity 4 times. In other words, there are 4 main captive elements which have held Klal Yisrael in a very powerful shvita and which has dominated the Koyach of Klal Yisrael. These are called the Dalet Shibudim, or fundamentally, and what they represent are the 4 kingdoms which have subjugated and dominated Klal Yisrael since the Churban Beis Hamikdash, the Bayis Rishon, until the Gula Asida. What were these Dalet Shibudim? These Dalet Shibudim are, the first one was the Babylonia, which destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. From the Churban Bayis Rishon was established, Klal Yisrael came under the dominion of the first Shibud, Bavel, Chaldea. The second one that occurred was Modai, or Paras, the Persians and the Medes. They destroyed Babylonia, and by doing that, they took over the world, and they took over Klal Yisrael with it. The third kingdom was Yavan, Greece, and of course Alexander the Great destroyed the Persians, and thus the Jews came into contact with him under his domination. And finally, the Greeks were destroyed by the Romans. And the Jews then came into contact with Rome. So since the Churban Bayis Rishon, we have been dealing with 4 Malchias, 4 kingdoms, each one representing a new dominating influence in the history of the Jewish nation beyond the Churban Bayis Rishon. Hanukkah is essentially an incident which occurred in Jewish history that had to do with Klal Yisrael versus Yavan. But in order for us to understand the meaning of Hanukkah, it really is important for us to understand is what the significance of these Dalet Shibudim are. What does it mean, these Dalet Shibudim? You see. And by doing that and understanding what these Dalet Shibudim are, we can maybe get some kind of understanding of what the specific interface was between Klal Yisrael and Yavan, and then understand from that the meaning of Hanukkah. This would seem to be the more fundamental way to approach the matter, rather than looking microscopically in the Inyan of Hanukkah itself. And this is the way I'd like to approach it at this point in time. There's a great deal to say about Hanukkah, but it would be very fruitful for us to look at it from a macroscopic view, from a very large viewpoint, in terms of Jewish history since the time of the first Churban Bayis itself. We've laid down the Yisod a long time ago, we repeated many times, on the concept that Klal Yisrael itself has a specific tachlis. Its tachlis, basically, is to bring a certain tikkun, a certain shlemus that it has to be zocher to in terms of all the Yidden of Klal Yisrael, in terms of the neshamas, and to the Bri itself. It does this by being shomer Torah mitzvahs, by being learning Torah and being shomer the Torah, the Kayag mitzvahs. It's moisef a great deal of kedusha, and by being moisef that kedusha itself, it brings itself, Klal Yisrael brings itself into a madrega where they can be shayach to Olam Haba. If Klal Yisrael fails to do that, then that kedusha, as we said a number of times before, goes into the hands of the Sultan, of the Makatrig himself. If for some reason Klal Yisrael does chatoim, then the Sultan, who's the Makatrig, then tainas to the Bnei Shalom, and the Sultan is able to capture certain of the kedusha that Klal Yisrael itself possesses. What we basically have said the long time also before is that kedusha has 2 basic characteristics. One, it has a characteristic called Tiferes, and it has a characteristic called Oz. The characteristic of Tiferes is a characteristic where from kedusha one can see the yichud habore in the bria. it's really, Tiferes really represents Chokhmah, or the ability to understand and see very clearly how everything in the Bria is connected into one basic principle, how all different events and all different phenomena, whether it's physical phenomena or historical events or any or ruchnistic phenomena, how all of these different events really are part of an integral whole, and as such they're connected to each other, so that there's a necessary relationship among all the various components. The ability to see this and to understand it is called Tiferes. We're not going to go into why it's called Tiferes, nor this done. We went into this many times before. Kedusha, to possess Kedusha is to possess this koyach of Tiferes. Kedusha has another koyach, which is called oiz, or strength, literally. What oiz really means is power, or basically strength. What it really means is hatzlocha, the ability to get things done, the ability to control and to dominate reality and affect things in reality in a successful way. That's really what oiz means. It's the ability to perform, the ability to achieve and to accomplish. Whoever possesses Kedusha possesses both Tiferes and oiz, meaning that it gives him a very great chokhmah and it gives him a very great capacity for hatzlocha. When Klal Yisrael does chatoim and loses Kedusha, that Kedusha goes into the hands of the Satan. And when it goes into the hands of the Satan, what happens is it goes into his proxies in this world, who are the Umas Ha'olam. So that the Kedusha then resides in the Umas Ha'olam, and they therefore take over certain of these characteristics. They begin to possess some of these traits or midas, in this case, Tiferes and oiz. And by possessing this, they really personify that which Klal Yisrael should have had, but lost. When these goyim who possess these characteristics now go and are meshabed Klal Yisrael through the asurim and the churbanos that are brought, to the golus that is brought, these oiz gradually return to Klal Yisrael itself. And we discussed this also before, and we're not going to go into it again, the notion of this concept of this triangular effect, and so on. But the Kedusha gradually goes back to Klal Yisrael as the Goyish nations are meshabed Klal Yisrael and give them Yisurim. And specifically, the nation, which is the receptacle for the specific Kedusha of Klal Yisrael at any point in time, is the critical messenger, or the critical vehicle to restore the Kedusha to Klal Yisrael. When we talk about it, the Dalet Shibudim and the Dalet Malchias, what we're fundamentally talking about are four vehicles, or four receptacles who have possessed this Kedusha of Klal Yisrael. And as they were meshabed Klal Yisrael, in terms of Yisur, in terms of Churbanos, they gradually gave back that Kedusha, so that Klal Yisrael eventually restored itself to its Gedula, and was able to get over the Kitrug against it. Because we have to remember, the thing which takes away the Kedusha, the Koyach from Klal Yisrael, is the Kitrug. Nothing more and nothing less. Without Kitrug, the Satan cannot do a thing. With Kitrug, he can do everything. Once Kitrug is established, the Nahanuch HaYichud can only then restore those earths by Shibur itself. Meaning that the Satan, that Nahanuch HaYichud must use the Satan himself and the Koyach of Ra to bring the Yeshua to Klal Yisrael. And we've seen this, we've spoken about this the time before, but we see this based in the Pasuk, Eis Tzor Yaakov Umimenu Yuvashea. It is a time of distress for Yaakov, and from the distress will be the Yeshua. Umimenu applies to the Tzorah. Not Umimenu, the Tzorah, the distress itself is the Yeshua of Klal Yisrael. This is the fundamental formula of the Hanagas HaYichud, where the Hanagas HaYichud uses the Ra. It uses the Koyach HaRa itself to bring the Gula from Klal Yisrael. Like I say, we've discussed these principles before. We will not elaborate again. The Dalet Shibudim therefore represents the four vehicles which will return this Tiferes and oiz to Klal Yisrael. When we say in the time of Hanukkah that Klal Yisrael interfaced with Yovan, the way to understand Hanukkah is to understand basically what the klipa of Yovan was. What ore did Yovan possess? What ore did Greece possess that was taken away from Klal Yisrael? When we look at the Greek tradition or the Hellenistic tradition, basically we see a very interesting thing. The Greek tradition is what's called, it's the most powerful tradition, even in our times, what's called the Greek tradition. It has influenced all of Western civilization. The Hellenistic tradition is basically the one of the introduction of philosophy, or the speculative understanding of the world into the Bria. Such a thing really never was in such a powerful way. What the Greeks did through their philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and all the other great philosophers, Archimedes and Pythagoras and so on, and the geometers and the mathematicians, was introduce certain critical concepts. They introduced the supremacy of nature. The supremacy of nature means what? It means the following. What the Greeks understood and realized, perhaps better than any other ummah before them, was the fact that the world, all of physical reality, obeys a strict code of law. It obeys a strict code of cause and effect, and that there's an union of teva. And they understood that the laws of teva, or the laws of the bria, the laws of physical reality, submit basically to the laws of teva by strict cause and effect relationships. Number one. They therefore understood basically the inner mechanism of physical reality. They understood the concept of natural forces in and of itself. The second thing they introduced was the notion that in order to understand these natural forces, one has to apply certain basic principles of analysis, specifically the principles of logic, both deductive and inductive. What is deductive and inductive? Deductive logic or deductive analysis fundamentally is the ability to reason something out by having certain premises and drawing certain conclusions from them. The Greek geometers, Euclid, Pythagoras, and so on and so forth, were the great logicians of that time. And what basically is involved in deductive logic is to have certain basic premises in front of you, and from these premises build a whole system of conclusions. The Euclidean elements of geometry indicated this particular approach to a very successful degree. The Greeks also innovated what's called inductive reasoning, which means the following. It's analyzing, not from the general to the particular, but from the particular to the general. It's the approach of looking at reality or to a specific event and asking yourself, what has determined that event? What causes that event to be the way it is? And by understanding that, by observing the event, and by asking questions of nature itself, by observing it, by measuring it, and explaining it, one is able to understand what the inner teva is itself. So the Greeks understood both of these things. They understood deductive logic and inductive logic through the Chachamim. Actually, the inductive logic was introduced by Archimedes, and the deductive logic was introduced even before by Socrates and Plato and so on and Aristotle. This approach to reality, this assumption of reality, that reality is teva, is nature, and the approach to understanding that through logical speculation was something the Greeks introduced. It gave also a new aspect of dominion of man over the Bria, supremacy. Because now that man can understand nature on his own terms, he can begin to control nature in his own way. It is the Greek tradition, which is the basis for all scientific tradition and the tradition of the West and civilization from that time on until this time now. The discovery of for example, of computers, of a microchip, or the discovery of the invention of a satellite or a rocket ship, all of these things are based on Greek tradition. It's nothing more than a continuation. Many historians hold that since the Greeks started and since they finished the concept of inquiry, of analytical processes, mankind has never really grown. And there's a certain merit to that argument. That the Greeks started with logic, and in a certain sense they ended logic. And all civilization after them, all Chokhmah after that, is nothing more than a corollary or a continuation of Greek thought. That's the tremendous contribution that Yavin gave to the world. The Yidden for the first time came into conflict with that tradition. What is the importance of that? The importance of that is that Yavin is very different than Bavel or Modai before them, or Edom after that. And this is what I'd like to do, to analyze these various shibudim and the koichas of these various different ummas, connected Klal Yisrael, to understand exactly what happened on Hanukkah. let's go back to the Churban Bayis Rishon and take a closer look at what the shibud was at that time. I want to give a while back we spoke at length about a certain important concept, the notion that the entire Bria, from Adam Rishon until the Shis Alpha Shnin, the whole 6,000 years, is essentially pivoted on two modes of avodah, or two modes of Giloi. The two modes of Giloi is the mode of Nevuah and the mode of Chochmah. Those are the two modes. As what we mentioned is that from the time of Adam Rishon until the time of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, which is until the time of Hanukkah, basically, or the time really before, until the time of Purim, the basic mode was Nevuah. And the last of the Nevi'im died out already by the time they died out by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, after the Churban Bayis Rishon. The last of the Nevi'im died out. After that, there were no longer any Nevi'im the way we know it. Instead, there were Chachomim. Chochmah was Mitzpashim. And we spoke at length about the difference between Chochmah and Nevuah. But basically, what we see very clearly is the following. Nevuah is an ability to understand aspects of reality or aspects of the Bria without inferential processes, without logic. It's an ability to understand the Chochmah through a certain dveikus with a very high level of ruchnius. Nevuah is of much closer contact to ruchnius than Chochmah. Chochmah is the ability to understand things without necessarily becoming very closely connected to ruchnius, and it employs logical processes. Nevuah is more powerful than Chochmah in the sense that Nevuah acts as ruchnius much more tangibly. But of the two, Chochmah is greater. Chochmah is greater than Nevuah in terms of the information that can actually be gathered. Chochmah is capable of understanding Yichud better than Nevuah in that sense. But Nevuah is much more powerful in its expression and in its experience. The world basically was dominated by the Inyan of Nevuah from the time of Adam Rishon until the time of Purim. That's the Inyan of Purim, which we're not going to get into, but the Inyan of Esther, or Hester, when the whole Inyan of Chochmah came to the Bria. If Nevuah was the essential mode of the world at that time, where the entire Avodah, the entire Asedes Yichudoi, is based on the Inyan, on the vehicle of Nevuah, it means that the whole matzav of the Bechira and the Avodah of Klal Yisrael is different than it was after. Because the Avodah which is totally by Nevuah is totally different than an Avodah which is totally by Chochmah. An Avodah which is totally by Nevuah means that there's a much greater Giloi. And we see Klal Yisrael in the time before in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash and before saw many great things. But there were many Nevi'im there who had direct access to the Bnei Shalom. There was the Beis HaMikdash with the Ashuras Ashina. There was the Tumim. There were nisim, constant nisim that Klal Yisrael saw and were visible to everyone. Which means that the whole Bechira must be affected, since the Gilui level is greater with the mode of Nevuah. Obviously the Bechira means that the Yetzer is also more powerful in certain ways. And basically, the Koyach which counteracts the power of Nevuah and the power of Nes is the power of Kishuv and the power of Avodah Zarah. The world at that time was given the parallel mode to Nevuah, and the parallel mode to Nevuah is Kishuv. The world therefore had these two things at its point. The avoid of Klal Yisrael and the battle, the machlokas, between the Satan, between Yetzer and Yetzer Tov, rested on a much greater Gilu level in those times. It was much clearly evident that Ruchnius was what controlled the world. But what was involved then is what Ruchnius controls the world. Where the Koyach HaKishuv and the Koyach of the Satan and Avodah Zarah attempted to understand that the world was controlled through koyches of Ruchnius of different than that of Kedusha. What we basically see in Klal Yisrael, from the time of Adam Rishon, actually from the time of Matan Torah, until the time of Purim, is that if the mode of Nevuah is the fundamental mode, which is the avodah rest, then the entire Bechira is different. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, it was destroyed by Bovel, and they were later conquered by Porus. Persia and Babylonia were two types of nations especially Babylonia, which excelled in magic or kishuv. They were very, very great in kishuv. And what the Baruch fundamentally said was that if I take away the koich of kedusha from Klal Yisrael, if I'm going to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, if that's what's going to happen, I will give you into a nation which has the koich opposite you, which is the koich of kishuv, which in this case was Bavel. Bavel excelled in the astrological sciences and all the different kishuv chochmas at that time. So the Baruch put Klal Yisrael into the hands of Bavel. Now what's very critical is that Bavel and Modai had a certain way of looking at reality. And this is what has to be understood. When you say that the world is dominated by the mode of Nevuah, what are we saying? We're saying the following, that the entire world sees very clearly that the laws of physical reality are really subservient to an Olam Ruchni. In other words, it was recognized by everyone that there was an Olam Ruchni, that there's an Olam Ruchni which governs the world. No one at that time believed that physical reality in and of itself had its own causational system as such, or was an end in itself. You see, all the nations of the world, since they all accessed either Nevuah or they accessed Tumah or Kishuv, they all knew very clearly that there was an Olam Ruchni. And no one thought that the physical reality is the only domain that exists and nothing else. That was obvious. This is the first thing. There was a clear distinction between the Olam Ruchni and the Olam Gashmi. And that it's the Olam Ruchni which has the Shlita. This was known by everyone because the Gila level was much higher. Except that when you're Oisip Kedusha, it's obvious that the Olam Ruchni is dominated by the Bnei Shalom. But in the Ummah Olam who were over the Avodah Zarah, and they wanted to connect themselves to Avodah Zarah, to the Kohen Kishuv, they felt that the Olam Ruchni was dominated in an aspect of Pirud, not Yichud but Pirud. Nevu was Megala Yichud, that's Einoi Vadoi, and Avodah Zarah is Megala Pirud. In other words, that there are many different koichas, there are many different ruchnistic forces, each one having its own shlita and its domain, its area of control. So basically, what we see in the time of the first, when Nevuah exists in the world was preoccupied with two shitas, either with the shita of Yichud, which is the shita of Klal Yisrael, the shita of the Torah, or the shita of Pirud. But in both cases, everyone agrees that it's the Olam Ruchni which dominates the Bria, not the Klal Yisrael in the Shibur of Bavel and Modai was still under the domain of Nevuah. Nevuah was the basic mode, which still was the control of the Bechir of the Bria at that time. So therefore, the Ummahs Olam that were Meshabbat Klal Yisrael were Ummahs that had Shaykhas to that, or Kishuv, and they had Shaykhas to that particular kind of parallel to Nevuah itself. Now something else very strange also happened with the Churban Bayis Rishon. Even though Klal Yisrael was taken over by Bavel, and it was Bavel that destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, there was something else which happened, a remarkable thing which happened at that time, which is really unnoticeable. When the first Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, an enormous amount of Kedusha left Klal Yisrael and went into the Klippas. Klippas meaning the Ummah Olam. We saw obviously that the Klippa, the main Klippa that the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael went to was Bavel, because Bavel destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. But fundamentally what Bavel had was the Koyach of Kishuv, and they had the Oiz. But there was a certain Nakuda of the Tiferes of that Kedusha that did not even go into Bavel. It went somewhere else. There was a certain aspect of that Tiferes which was not from Nevuah or Kishuv, because Kishuv also has a certain mode of Tiferes. But what it is it went away and left Bavel and all the Shibudim, all the nations at that time, and went into a foreign nation which was not even strong at that time. What we noticed is that in the same year, 586 BCE, or around that time, Greece started its Greek tradition, the Hellenistic tradition of philosophy. In about 580, there lived in Greece a man, Thales of Miletus, who was called the father of science. He lived also about 580 BCE, at the same time as the Churban Beit HaMikdash. In other words, the whole Greek tradition of Chokhmah and of philosophy started with Thales. That far back. So we have to ask ourselves a very interesting question. Where did Greece all of a sudden get its koyach from? the beginning of Yovan as the philosophical force, the beginning of Yovan as the representative of the mode of Chokhmah started at the Churban Bayis Rishon. How? What happened? Obviously, it came from the Churban Bayis Rishon itself, except that the Ikar Koyach of the Kedusha went into Bavel. But there was a certain amount of that Kedusha that went into Yovan. But that Kedusha, that Feres, which relates to Chokhmah, was not yet a viable force. Why? Because the world was still controlled by the mode of Nevuah. And since it was controlled by the mode of Nevuah, the Shibud of Klal Yisrael can only relate to those ummahs that have to do with parallel modes, those nations which have to do with Kishuv, the same type of Giloy. You see, the mode of Chokhmah did not yet exist on the world at that time, but it started. The Churban Beis HaMikdash not only tore up Klal Yisrael and gave the Kedusha to Bavel, but it took away a certain aspect of the Or and started the union of the mode of Chokhmah itself. So that the Churban Beis HaRishon started two things. You see, first of all, it destroyed the Beis HaMikdash and started the first Golus. But not only that, it started the beginning of when the world will begin to leave the mode of Nevuah and go into the mode of Chokhmah. Even though that doesn't happen until later on. But the Haskalah took place at that time. When finally did Klal Yisrael come into contact with the mode of Chokhmah itself? When the mode of Chokhmah itself began to take force after the Persians at that time, that's when it began to come up. And of course it began to come up with the Greek philosophers of Plato, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, who lived about 300 to 400 BCE in those years, which corresponds basically to Modai and Poras, which means that we find a very interesting parallel, that as the world was losing the Nevuah mode, it was slowly beginning to develop the Chokhmah mode. What is the Chokhmah mode? The Chokhmah mode has certain basic premises. The Chokhmah mode believes in the world as an end itself, that it has what's called natural law, and that the world is governed by its own cause and effect. In other words, what the Chokhmah mode does, it separates the Olam Mukhni from the Olam Gashmi, and it discounts the Olam Mukhni. As far as Chokhmah is concerned, there is no more Olam Mukhni, because the Olam Mukhni is not subject to speculation. All that truly exists is the Olam Gashmi. So the mode of Chokhmah was the first mode that began to remove and divorce the Olam Mukhni back away and no longer deal with it. So the mode of Chokhmah brought a new hesed into the Bria. That's number one. That's fundamentally what it did. And it supplied the tool in which to understand that Teva, which of course is logic. That mode came into being through Yovan. And Yovan first got its ore from the Churban Bayis Rishon. But Chokhmah as a mode did not come into play until the 3rd century BCE. So therefore, when Klal Yisrael was then ready for its next Shibud, it would meet the nation who was the supreme carrier of that mode. So when Klal Yisrael then finally came into contact with the 3rd Shibud, because of the Ketugim, it would finally come into contact with the Ummah which represented the mode of Chokhmah itself, and that's Yovan. At that point in time, the Bria had already gone over into the mode of Chokhmah. So the next Shibud would be the nation which represents that, and that was Yovan itself. Yovan represented that mode in the sense that they were the fundamental originators of that Chokhmah itself. Now, before we go into Hanukkah, I would like to discuss one more thing, which is the union of Edom. How does Edom relate to this? Obviously, what we see is a very interesting thing, that the concept of Tiferes, or the concept of that mode of Chokhmah, was given by the Greeks. So the question is, what was the Klip of Edom? We know that the Klip of Edom was the greatest of all Klippos. It's the most powerful of all Shibudim. Yet clearly, Edom is not the one who originated the concept of Chokhmah, and is not the one who really gave the Tiferes to the Bria. They are not the one who captured Osiris. What does Edom do? This is what we have to understand, the relationship between Edom and Yovan. And then finally, both of them connect to Klal Yisrael. Edom basically is Esav. And what Yitzchak said to Esav, when he said, Akol kol Yaakov ve'adayim de Esav, this bracha remained intact unto all time. Esav is your dayam. Esav will never have shaykhs to a koil. A koil is what? Torah, chokhmah, understanding. Bino, the understanding of Haskalah, the union of Haskalah, or to be maskal, and to understand these things, is not a parsha of Edom. It's a parsha of Edom. Why? Because Esav is only an Indian of Yadayim. It's only an Indian of Oiz. So therefore, Edom could not create the Indian of Teferet or the Indian of Chochmah. It remains for Yavon to do that. But Edom, by taking over Yavon, swallowed this Chochmah and made it part of their own tradition. And with the might of Edom, of Rome, the power and the oaths of Rome, they were able to take that first and spread it to the entire world. Now, it's very important to understand this historically, because the amazing thing is that Roman tradition or Roman culture did nothing for the world that the Greeks had not already done. And this is very important to understand. Even though the Romans conquered the entire world, and they subjugated every nation under it, and they influenced every nation under it, they contributed very little in the way of originality into the Bria. The only thing that they really put into the Bria was law, the legal and the political systems of Rome, their mode of governing, their legal system, and their military systems. But when it came to Chochmah, you will not find great Roman philosophers. You will really not find it, or great scientific traditions among Romans. The Romans only produced military might and administrative control. Why? Because Edom was no shaykhs to Chochmah. Edom was shaykhs to Koyach, or to Oiz. Where does Edom take its Chochmah from? From Yavon. So therefore, Yavon and Edom constitutes the two or the twins, in that sense. Where Yavon contributes to Teferet, and Edom contributes to Oiz. And these two together is what contributes to all as it's taken away from Klal Yisrael. Now, what is the comparison between Yavon and Edom that have to do with the mode of Chochmah, and Bovel and Modai that have to do with the mode of the mode of Nevuah? And here's a very interesting thing, which is a sharp difference between the two. Bovel and Modai, even though they took over Klal Yisrael, were essentially alien forces. Bovel had a certain religion, an alien religion, which had no shaykh to Yidden, and Modai had its own religion, which had no shaykh to Yidden. When both of those took over the Koyach of Klal Yisrael, they took it over Ba'oz, you see, and that's it. They destroyed the Beis HaMikdash and they took it over. But Yavon and Edom are very different, and in that sense, Yavon and Edom are much greater shibudim than Bovel and Modai. Why? Yavon contributes Chochmah, philosophy, science. Edom contributes Christianity. Now, basically, when you look at both philosophy and Christianity, you begin to see a new element in what's called a truly competitive system to Yadus. Why? Because the Greeks come over to a Jew. The Yavon, a Greek person in that time, would come over to a Yid and say, what are you saying? You're saying that your Torah is correct? You're mistaken. My Chochmah is what's important. In other words, who says that your view of looking at the world is correct? I will prove to you through logic and through speculation that my view of looking at the world is correct. I will present to you a very closely knit, logical, cohesive system about what the world is made of and how the world is constructed. Let's see, which is the equal of your Torah. So what Yavon did was introduce what's called a competitive system to Yiddishkeit. Edom also introduced a competitive system. What was the competitive system? Christianity. Because the Goy will come over to the Yid and say, you say that you have a religion that has to do with Kedusha, with Tahara, that has to do with mitzvahs and tzaddikim, that has to do with the Mashiach and the Gula. We also have that religion. Not only that, we took over your religion, because we are now the true chosen of God and not you. So Edom also comes over to Klal Yisrael and says, we now competing with you. So we find that the second Shibudim, the second two klipos of Yavon and Edom, do something, they interrelate with Klal Yisrael in a way which has never been done before. Both of them come over to Yidden and say, we are better than you, because we have a system which is superior to yours, and we can compete with you on your own ground. Yavon and Edom say, Yavon says, I compete with you, Klal Yisrael, on the ground of Teferet, and Edom says, I compete with you, Klal Yisrael, on the grounds of Oiz, because it's my religion which dominates the world, not yours. And my religion has the same basic premises as yours. It's also involved in the same concepts as yours. You see. So Yavon and Edom now are taking it first in Oiz, and they both said, we will now dominate the world, and we compete with you in terms of the validity of your own religion. No other Shibur ever introduced that notion to Klal Yisrael. Because of that, because of the fact that Yovim and Edom are competitors to Klal Yisrael, they're not adversaries. Bovel and Modai were adversaries. They were antagonists. They wanted to destroy Klal Yisrael in terms of Klal Yisrael itself. But Yovim and Edom are antagonists to Klal Yisrael, not in an adversary relationship, but in a competitive relationship. They maintain that they both now have the field and they are supreme to Klal Yisrael. Because of that, because of the fact that they are competitors, they are a much greater threat to Klal Yisrael than Bovel and Modai. Because now, Bovel and Modai was only a threat to the Chetzonis of a Yid. You see, Bovel and Modai had no shittas at all. The clip of Bovel and Modai was not attractive to the Panimis of a Yid. It was only attractive to the Guf, or to the Chetzonis of a Yid. But the sheet of Yovim and Edom is attractive to the Seichel of a Yid, which means it hits the Pnimius. Because of that, the clip is a much deeper clip. It's much more profound in that sense. That's why Bovel and Modai were much weaker Shibudim, because their attraction was simply one of an adversary, and it simply had some kind of enticement as far as the Guf is concerned. Yovim and Edom had an enticement in terms of the Pnimius of Yid itself, because it said, we will compete with your Torah. We will compete with everything you've learned, and we will say that we are true. Not that we're stronger than you. Bovel and Modai, all Bovel and Modai said was, we're more powerful than you. We have more eyes. But Yovim and Edom says, we are more powerful than you, and we are more truthful than you. We have the emes. Not only do we have a koyach, we also have an emes. You see. And by saying we have an emes which will be attractive and which will appeal to your sichlius itself, to your pnimius. So Yovim and Edom are much greater threats to Klal Yisrael than Bovel and Modai. Because the threat which comes from the mode of Chochmah is much greater than the threat that comes from the mode of Nevuah. That's why the competition of Yovim and Edom versus Klal Yisrael is the competition of Yichud versus Yichud. Klal Yisrael says, we're Masig Yechudai. And Yovim and Edom says, no, we're Masig Yechudai. You see, it's no longer like the old Baalei Avodah Zarah that used to say, well, instead of your Yichud, instead of your one Buddhism, we have our periods, we have our many gods, our polytheistic religions. That's not what it is. It's not Yichud versus period anymore. It's Yichud versus Yichud. Klal Yisrael says, we're Masi Yechudoi, Einod Mavadoi. So the Greeks will say, Yecharami Einod Mavadoi. But it's the Bria. God is nature. God is not in the Ilam Mukhni. He's taka nature. And by being masig nature, by masig the laws of reality, you can see an emes of Yichud. And Edom would say the same thing, that Christianity is also an Indian of Yichud. Why? Because it's also an Indian of bringing the world to a tikkun, where there's a hashkacha to the Bria, in that sense, and the world ultimately come to the belief in what do you call it, in the Ilam Mukhni. So therefore, Yovim and Edom present a sheet of Yichud versus the sheet of Klal Yisrael of Yichud, which is a much greater threat to Klal Yisrael. Now that we understand these concepts, basically, of the Dalet Shibudim and the evolution, you see, of the concept of the mode of Nevuah to Chochmah, and therefore the transfiguration of the threat of each one of these Shibudim from the Chetzonius to the Pnimius of Klal Yisrael, now we can enter into the stage of Hanukkah. Because what was Hanukkah? Hanukkah was the first time that the Jews met the mode of Chochmah. Never before did the Yidden meet the mode of Chochmah, you see, on an adversary relationship. And before them they simply had to deal with Avodah Zarah. No, Avodah Zarah is only attractive what? They're attractive to the Guf. How? They're attractive to the Taivas. Whatever the story is. But fundamentally all the Indian of Arayas and all the things that they want to be matter were Indian of a Guf. Avodah Zarah speaks to the Guf of the Yid, who wants to be matter the things that have to do with Guf. But Chochmah wants to be matter much more, because it wants to deal with the sickness of the person. Modai, or Poras, which was the Shibud of Modai, which came from Haman, for example, who was in the kingdom of Achashverosh, wanted to destroy what? He wanted to destroy the Guf of Klal Yisrael. If you look at the Aranisim, you'll find that it says in Chanukah, Bimei Matisyo, it says there, it says, it's similar Lashon, it says, Kisho Omdo Malchus Yovno Rishon Alamcha Yisrael, what? What does Malchus Yovno want to do? La'ashkicham Terosacha, Ula'aviru Mechukum Etzanecha, how? It wasn't that they wanted to destroy the Torah and Avodah by forcefully. They wanted to convince Klal Yisrael of the Tiferes of Chochmah. That was their koyach vashpah. But what does it say by Purim? What does it say by the shibud of Poras? It says, Kisha Omad Aleim, Haman Rasha. In that case, it was Haman who was Omar Aleim, not Malchus Yovel. What did he want to do? Bikesh lahashmid la'arig la'abed. He wanted to kill them in their guf. Haman wanted to destroy their guf, and Yovel wanted to destroy their neshama. Why? For the basic reason that they were dealing with different shibudim at different points in history. The shibud of Bavel and Modai, and the shibud of that time of Haman, where Haman was part of, was the shibudim that related to the mode of Nevuah. The mode of Nevuah relates to the mode of Kishuv and Avodah Zorah, which is simply an attraction to the guf of Klal Yisrael, in that sense. So therefore, Haman, who was an adversary against Klal Yisrael, or Bavel, wanted to destroy Klal Yisrael bigufam, the Chitzonius. But Yovel and Modai were klippas which were representative of Chochmah. And Chochmah is an attraction not to the guf, but to the panemius, to the sichlius of Klal Yisrael. So they weren't interested in killing Jews. They wanted to convince them that the Chochmah was at first, and they wanted to make them forget the Hashtichim Torah Sacha. They wanted to make them forget the Torah and to be maver on the mitzvahs. That's what they wanted. They wanted to take up their neshama away, not their guf. Why? Because that's the power of Chochmah. And Chochmah is greater than Nevuah in that sense. So the power of the klippas that came through Chochmah was greater than the power of the klippas that came through Nevuah. Because they have the power of Yichud versus Yichud, not Yichud versus Purud, which is what Poras and Moda had. The Greeks did not believe in a personal God the way they do. They believed that God was synonymous. They believed that God was synonymous with nature. You see, and that the Yichud is the first and the law and order which exists in nature. That's what the Greeks. That's why the Greeks were the first ones that made the Olympics, because the Greeks, since they worshipped nature and they believed in the intimate Chochmah and the ultimate Chochmah nature, they believed in the power of the human body, in the beauty of the human body. No other culture ever did that. No other culture ever were interested in the human form, in human physique, or glorified human body. It was the Greeks that glorified the human body, and they were the ones who were into exercise and all these things, and the first of the human body. Why? Because they were into nature. They went to those things which relate to nature itself. Now, what's the Indian of Hanukkah? Basically, what the Indian of Hanukkah is that the first time the Yidden came in confrontation with the klippa that had to do with Chochmah was in the time of the Seleucid dynasty. Really, that's when they felt the full weight of what the Greeks had worked on for the last 300 years. Suddenly, a major, if you want to call it in euphemistic terms, Hanukkah represents a major marketing effort on the part of the Greeks to introduce the Tiferes of Chochmah, or to introduce the competition of Chochmah as a Yichud versus Torah as a Yichud. That's a euphemism, because it was more than a marketing effort. They wanted to force Yidden to do it. But basically that's what it was. It was a marketing effort. It was an attempt to convince Yidden that what? That there was a much greater Yichud and Tiferes in Chochmah that there wasn't Torah. And this is what they wanted to promote. When we spoke the other time about Hinduism and so on, that the Hindu tradition was different. The Hindu tradition was the ability or the desire to reach emes by obtaining a knowledge, a subjective knowledge of inner experience of the true self, by going inward. The Hindus were not, or the yogis were not concerned with machshava. They were concerned with self-revelation, with union of the ego, of the self, with the self, which is an inward experience. They weren't concerned with the physical reality. As far as the Hindus are concerned, physical reality is maya, is illusion. You see, what they're concerned with was the emes of the inner panemius, which we said is also a teva-dika thing. It's interesting, they also had teva. They also approached it al-yidei chokhmah. Yoga is also chokhmah. But that chokhmah, the direction of that chokhmah was inward. You see, whereas the direction of the chokhmah of Greece is outward, because the Greeks were interested in outside reality, nature, in the laws of reality, by the use of machshava. You see, the Greeks deified thought or machshava, whereas the yogas deified self-reflection or insight, inward experience. In both cases, it's reached through chokhmah, through teva, but it's a totally different experience. That's because the East took a different part of the Kedusha, as we explained, which is the Kedusha, which has to do with the Indian or the emes of a Dveikistic experience. Whereas the Greeks took the Indian of the emes of a Machshavatic experience. But that's what they wanted to promote in Klal Yisrael. What do we see from this basically? That this was the first interface between Klal Yisrael and the first clip of Chokhmah. What did Klal Yisrael do? Klal Yisrael said, no, we refuse. We refuse to do this. We refuse to accept the fact that your Chokhmah is a greater first than the Torah. You see. So Klal Yisrael refused that. They fought against them. They fought against the Greeks and they won, and they came to the Beis HaMikdash and they restored the menorah. What's the union of the menorah? And this comes down to the Pnimis Hadova, where I think that it relates to Hanukkah. But there's something that's very clear. You have to understand what exactly the union of the menorah had to do with the thing. All of the different things, all the different entities or objects in the Beis HaMikdash symbolizes different hashpos, different oris, different tikunim. The menorah, which was the light inside the Heichal, essentially was the instrument which symbolized the Or of the Shekhinah itself. It means it symbolizes the Or HaGonos, or the Or HaTorah. The Or HaTorah as it is. What Chazal was essentially saying to the Greeks, the Or HaTorah is superior to your Chokhmah. It was superior to your Chokhmah. By countering the Greeks, and by going back into the Beis HaMikdash and lighting up the Neres, fundamentally they were re-establishing the supremacy of the Or HaTorah to the Chokhmah of the Greeks. But there's something much deeper here. What the Banishim did was perform a tremendous nest. What was the nest that he did? It lasted 8 days. I'm not going to go into the whole Indian why 8 days, this and so on. I'm not concerned with the Cheshbonis here. But the truth of the matter is, why is it that the Chazal did not massacre this whole mitzvah of that nest, really, to symbolize that? Why is it that when we read Al Anisim, we talk about the nest, that they were able to destroy the Greeks, but on Hanukkah, in terms of the Pesumanisa, we light the candles? Why is it that in terms of the mitzvah of Hadlakas Haner, when it comes to the mitzvah of Pesumanisa in one side, it has to do with the candles. But the mitzvah of Pesumanisa on the other side has to do with the fact that we've defeated the Greeks in that sense. Because fundamentally they really represent the same thing. What do I mean the same thing? And this is the essence of the matter. This is basically the essence of the Or Pnimi, the Or Gonas. It is the essence of Torah itself. What is this, the essential sheet of Yichud of Klal Yisrael? What is the essential sheet of the Yichud of Klal Yisrael? The Banishim Hashem Echad, Shva Yisrael Hashem Lekenu Hashem Echad. There's only one Rebbeinu Shalom. What does it mean that there's only one Rebbeinu Shalom? Einoid Mavada. It means that he has what's called absolute independence. There is nothing outside of him. Everything that is through him and through his will. If the Banishim has a Ratzon Lehetiv, if that's why he created the Bria, then everything which is created is an aspect of that Hatava. But we see, even in the world, we see Ra. No. If we say Einoid Mavadoi, it means that Ra is an aspect of Hatova. You see. That we say there's Indian Tova Meitav, that even that, Eitzor Yaakov Umimeni Yevashaya, that Yeshua comes from the Tzorah, even evil. The Tzorahs that come in Klal Yisrael, that itself is the Gul of Klal Yisrael. That itself is the description of the fact that Einoid Mavadoi. What is the sheet of Einoid Mavadai? It's the shita that the Banishim controls all of reality. He controls not only that which we think is logical, but he controls that which appears to be illogical. In other words, even if we look at certain things and we see two opposing forces, Ra and Toiv, and we say these two are antithetical in nature, and since they're adversaries and antithetical in nature, they must come from two different origins. That's what logic says. That's what observation, that's what analysis says. But Einoid Mavado says, no, not so. Einoid Mavado says that even though they appear to be adversary, they appear to be antithetical, and they appear to have two different origins, Einoid Mavado means Afilu B'chshofim, like Chazal say. Einoid Mavado, that they both have one origin. The Banishim is the origin of both. How could the Bonisham be the origin of two opposite forces? That's the meaning of Yichud HaBorei. The essence of Yichud HaBorei is that the Bonisham is the makor and the shurish and the origin of all forces in the Bria, even those that appear totally antithetical, those that appear totally opposite. That's the meaning of Yichud HaBorei. When the Greeks understood that reality had an Indian of Yichud, they understood that everything in reality is governed by cause and effect. There's a logic and there's a mechanism which governs. But the Greeks did not have a way to explain how antithetical forces can be explained by the same koyach. That they could understand, because logic will not permit that. Logic will not give a person to understand how it's possible, you see, for something to exist or not exist at the same time. How is it possible for evil and good, which are two opposite forces, to come from the same koyach? It's not possible to understand how evil, or absolute evil, what we perceive to be absolute evil, can be the shliach of Toim. It's not given to understand. This is beyond the chokhmah of the Greeks. It's beyond their understanding of Yichud. But it's not beyond the understanding of Yichud of the Torah. The supremacy of the Torah, of the Or Torah, the supremacy of the Orgonos, the supremacy of the Torah in its emes tzura is to understand that the Bonisham is the Yichud, the Bonisham is the sholet of the entire Bria of all forces, even though it's the opposite. And the Bonisham said, I will demonstrate it to you, Klal Yisrael. The Bonisham said to Klal Yisrael, you refuse to give in to the Greeks. Refuse to accept that chokhmah as the true description of reality. And I will prove to you my yichud. I will show you things which cannot be done with normal law and order. And that's what we see. Rabim biyad ma'atim. Gibor biyad chaloshim. How is it possible for weak to conquer the mighty and the few to conquer the many? Normally that's impossible. By the laws of normal military strategy it will be impossible. But not by the laws of Yichud. Because Yichud says that I will produce a nest, which that's what it was. If Ram B'Yam Ma'atam and Giboim Chaloshim, that's a nest. That was also a nest. Yichud says that I will produce such a nest. So what the Bonishim said is Mida, he says, Mida Keneged Mida. What fundamentally he says, Klal Yisrael was this. Deny the Chochmah of the Greeks, deny the fundamental premise of what? Of their concept of Yichud, which is nothing more than a higher, better way of saying Yeshud Mavadoi. That's all it is. It's a better way, it's a fancy way of saying Yeshud Mavadoi. Because even their Chochmah cannot understand the Yichud. Deny that. And I will save you through the Midas HaYichud itself. You see, I will save you through the premises and through the principles which allow Yichud to operate, which permit Ram B'Yad Ma'atim and Gibor Merat Chaloshim. When you go Keneged HaTeva, if you go Keneged HaTeva, that's the only way you can do it. Ram B'Yad Ma'atim and Gibor Chaloshim cannot go B'Yad HaTeva. But what the Bonishim is saying is, deny the Chochmah of the Greeks. Deny the belief in Teva. And I will perform with you Mida Keneged Mida. Accept the supremacy of Torah and Einoid Mavadoi, and I will be noyeg in the Mida of Einoid Mavadoi. And what's the Mida of Einoid Mavadoi? L'mayla Madech HaTeva, which is Ram B'Yad Ma'atim and Gibor Me'at Chaloshim. You see, this was the nest, and that's why this was the Ika nest. The Ika nest was the very shlit of Klal Yisrael. Because of the kittut on Klal Yisrael, the Yavonim was sholet on them. And the shlita on Klal Yisrael was a shlita of a Yeshiv Mavadoi B'derech HaChochma, B'tzus HaChochma. Before that, it used to be a Yeshiv Mavadoi B'tzus Avodah Zorah, B'tzus of a certain Yetzor of Ruchnius. Now it's a Yeshiv Mavadoi B'tzus HaChochma. So the Baruch Shem says, fight that. Fight that Yetzor, and I will save you, what? B'tzus HaYichud. I will save you L'mayla Madech HaTeva. If you deny their Teva, I will save you L'mayla Madech HaTeva. Which is what? Ram B'Yad Me'atim and Gibor Me'at Chaloshim. This was the nest itself. That's why the Tefillah doesn't say anymore in Alanisim. It's sufficient to understand that we were saved when we shouldn't have been saved. In other words, even though the kitzuk against Klal Yisrael was enormous, it was so enormous that the Greeks should have swallowed up Klal Yisrael. The Bonishim said, do tshuva, fight against them, accept the Einoid Mavadoi, and the Mida will save you as well. I will perform a nest for you so that it will perform as well. But what is the nest? The nest is not only the fact that I saved you from the Greeks, but I saved you from the kitzuk of the Satan. That's what I saved you. Matzel oni mi goizloi. I saved the Oni Megoizloi. Who guzzles the Oni? Why is he an Oni? The Oni is an Oni not because he's poor, the Kesef. He's only because he's poor with Das. He's poor with Chusim. The Gazlan is the Sultan who wants to take the Koyach of Klal Yisrael from the Ketugim. So what it says there, Mi Yidmelach, Mi Yishvelach, who is like you? Why? Because you were able to be Matzil, the Oni Megoizloi. You were able to take the Oni, who was supposed to be an Oni because of the Ketug. And you're able to be Matzil that Oni, Afa B'She'eno Hogin, Afa B'She'eno Kedai. Against the Ketug. But how can you do that? Only because you go over Teva. Only because you're a Bonisham above Elokim. You're not a Bonisham that has to do with Din, with Teva. You're a Bonisham that has to do with Chesed, which has to do with the Shem Havaya, which has to do with the Mava Midoisav, who has the capacity to do Lachem. You see, Echanan Lachem. That's the Indian of the Yichra Borei. That's the Indian of Chanukah. The Indian of Chanukah is the Indian of being Matzil Oni Megoizloi. That the Bonisham was able to save Klal Yisrael from the Kitug of the Satan, so that he could then save Klal Yisrael from the Yetzirah, from the Pitoi of the Yevonim. And what was the Pitoi of Yevonim? The Shita of Yeshua Mavadoi through Chochmah. And when Klal Yisrael just started, when they rebelled, the Bonisham said, you start, and I will do the rest. You start. Pischali, Pesach Shel Machad. Just open me the eye of a needle. Just start. Just rebel against the Greeks, in a sense, deny their Shita. And I will open for you a tremendous Pesach to save you from them and their Shita, not only from their Shita, but I will demonstrate that their Shita is wrong, through the very historical circumstance itself. By Rabin Biyad Miatim, V'Gibon Biyad Chaloshim. This is the direct historical evidence of my Yichud. Forget about logical inquiry as such. I will prove to you historically and phenomenologically that my Yichud is the emes, and that Torah is the emes. So when the Yidden went in the Beis HaMikdash after that, they lit the candle and it went another 7 days. This was a nest, but this was the second nest that already occurred after the first nest. It was nothing more than an extension of the original Yichud, of the Rabin Biyad Miatim. In that sense. In the sense that what the Bonishim was saying is that the menorah, which is the Indian of the Torah governs not B'derech HaTeva, which is the belief of the Greeks, but L'mayla B'derech HaTeva. The very essence of the menorah itself is L'mayla B'derech HaTeva. Why? Because the essence of the Torah is the essence of the Yichra Borei. But the Yichra Borei is Afa Pishe'eno Gil V'Afa Pishe'en Gadai. That the Bonishim is able to save the Bria through the Hanukkah HaYichud. He's able to use Ra to be the Shliach of Toiv. That itself is L'mayla B'derech HaTeva. The whole Hafsog of Yichra Borei is something that has no Shaykh to Teva to begin with. You see. So the fact of the menorah then to burn for another 7 days is not a big mile for the menorah. That wasn't the net. The menorah. That is the menorah. That's the mahut of the menorah. That's the mahut of the way the Bonishim functions in the Bria. The Bonishim is the L'mayla B'derech HaTeva. The Torah is the L'mayla B'derech HaTeva. As such. When the Levim carried the Oron on the bottom, they carried the Adam until the Oron Abris, which symbolized the Torah. The Levim used to carry it to the Midbar with the 2 poles, the bottom, until they came to a river, and suddenly the Oron picked itself up and flew to the other side. So you say the Oron had the ability to fly and schlep all the Levim hanging on like a plane. So then what do you need bottom for the Levim to carry the Oron for? Because that's the thing, because the Gaba, the hest of the Bria, the Bonishim wants you to carry the Torah, to your avoidance, your tikkunim. But don't think for 1 minute that the Torah is totally on your maitam, that the essence of the Torah is totally on what you give it. The Torah is l'mayla b'derech HaTeva, because it functions on the mitzvah HaYichud, not on the mitzvah HaMishpat. And the Bonishim says, watch, now the Torah will carry you. Suddenly it picks itself and flies. So what the Bonishim says is, not that the Oren can't fly whenever it wants, it can always fly. But that's not a tachlis. Its panemius is flight. Its panemius is l'mayla b'derech HaTeva. And that's how I govern the Bria. But your panemius, your Indian has to be b'derech HaVoda, b'derech HaMishpat. So you have to carry the Oren with the bottom, which is Mishpat, which is law and order. It's Teva. It's something which can be predicted. It's something within the natural frame of the world. This is the essence of Chanukah. The 2 shitas. The sheet of reality in terms of Teva, law and order, cause and effect, natural law that governs the world, or the sheet of the Torah, the concept of Yichud, the concept of engaging 2 adversary forces and seeing them as one koyach, the ability to use Ra for the purposes of Torah, the Indian of Yichra Borei. Which sheet does Klal Yisrael accept? And fundamentally what Klal Yisrael said, we accept the sheet of Torah. So the Rebbe said, you accept the sheet of Torah and not the sheet of the Greeks, then you will be saved by that midah. You accept the midah yichud, then I will be poil midah yichud. It will be rabban b'yad me'atam and giborim b'yad chaloshim. And when you go into the base of Mikdash and you light the menorah which is the symbol of the Torah itself, will perform the nest, not because it's a nest, a special nest outside the menorah itself, but that nest will show you the panemius of the menorah itself. The nest of going from day to day, those extra things are being able to burn. An extra 7 days on that same container of oil is not a nest in and of itself, anything strange. It's the nest because it's a reflection of the essence of the menorah itself. And it's also a continuation of the original victory of the Maccabees over the Greeks themselves. Therefore, in the Shemoneh Esrei, when we say Al Nisim, the essence of the Pesum Nisa is really in the fact of Rabban B'yad Chaloshim, Rabban B'yad Gratim, and Gibor B'yad Chaloshim. This is the essence of the nest. Why? Because this is the historical event which freed us from that klippa, and we were freed only in the schus of Yichud itself, not in the schus of Mishpat. The Greeks, who essentially promoted the concept of Mishpat, the concept of Din, the concept of Elokim, as saying that this is the aspect, this is the dominating force in reality. The Rebbe said, this is not what it is. The Yidden were saved because they chose the mid of Yichud. They saw the mid of Havaya, that's the Indian of Lamayla B'dech HaTeva. So the nest is performed, they were able to defeat the Greeks, who were much greater than them militarily. And when they came to the Beit HaMikdash, and they put on the menorah, the Rebbe said, I will now show you what the menorah is, in its panemius. Just like I show you what the Oren is when it flies over the lake or the river, I will show you what the menorah is in its panemius. In the fact that the menorah can keep on giving an awe, to be made an awe, which is much greater than that which normally is capable of. Even though one container of oil was able to last only 1 day, so b'derech hateva, light can only come out from that. The Rebbe says, but 7 more days of light will come out from that one container. Meaning that the capacity to produce light from Teva has nothing to do with Teva itself. The medium which the Rebbe is knowing the Bria has nothing to do with the restrictions of Teva. It has to do with what you're zeicha to, Masad your Avodah. And if you're zeicha Masad your Avodah, the Rebbe will be put on the nest to you, because that's exactly the midah that you're totally on. This is basically the idea of Hanukkah. And that's what we do in the Neres and Adlokas HaNeres, when we're fasting nest. We light those candles. Why? We modulate the Neres to show what a menorah is. A menorah which is the essence of Torah, which is the Or Torah itself, is the Inyan of Hanogas HaYichud. It's the Inyan of Einoid Mevadoi. That's what a menorah is. And when we light this, when we're fasting this nest, and when we daven, when we're fasting the actual Shevach, of the fact that the Rebbe was massacred in the actual historical event itself. But both are really the same thing. One is the application and the other is the principle. The menorah and the fact that the menorah produces the light, L'mayla B'derech HaTeva, that the Rebbe is noig with the Bria, L'mayla B'derech HaTeva, that's the inyan of the menorah. The menorah is Megala, the Tzura, the emet of Pneumius of Torah itself. The historical event, the reality, the fact that there was a nest that occurred to Klal Yisrael, that they were saved from the Greeks realistically, is the application of that principle. That's all it is. Al Nisim is Meshabeach the Bonishim for the application of the Hanogas HaYichud, and the Adlokas HaNeres is Mefalsam, is Meshabeach the Bonishim for the principle of the Hanogas HaYichud. The menorah symbolizes the principle of the Hanogas HaYichud, and Al Nisim symbolizes the application of the Hanogas HaYichud. But fundamentally, both of them is the Hanogas HaYichud. And we see this when we say Ashrei, Tzadik Hashem b'chol dvochav, v'chosed b'chol ma'asav. What does that mean, Tzadik Hashem b'chol dvochav? What does that mean? It says the Baruch Hashem is a Tzadik in his dvochim. What's his derech? The derech of the Baruch Hashem is mishpat. The Baruch Hashem created the world, they want to give him a tzakanam, l'ksuf alidei b'chiru alidei mitzvah. In that sense, his derech, the way that he wants to be known the world, is through mishpat. And that's why he's a Tzadik. When it comes to the derech of the Baruch Hashem, the derech in which he created the world, the way he wants the world to actually fear, he's a tzaddik, the Hanogas HaMishpat. But l'maisa v'chosed Hashem b'chol ma'asav. Why? Because when it comes down to reality, Yidden don't follow. They can't follow. They do chatoim. So the Baruch Hashem can't be noyeg as a tzaddik. Legabe is derech, he's a tzaddik. But legabe myself, legabe the mice of the bria, legabe reality, history. History is not filled with tzaddikim. History is filled with yidden doing chatoyim. So the Baruch has to be noyig as a chosed. He has to go to Fnei Mishus Adin. He has to go at Bila Hanukkah Yichid to be master of the bria. David HaMelech says it himself. Tzaddik Hashem b'chol duachot. Legabe the derech, legabe the kavon of the bria. It's the Hanukkah Mishpat. But legabe the actual tikkun of the bria, in terms of what really happens, the Baruch is a chosed. He's noyach b'yechudai, and that's the need of the menorah. The need of the menorah is that the Baruch is poil of the midas hachasidus. Why is the Baruch poil of midas hachasidus? Why? Because the Baruch is the only one in reality who can be a chosed. We can only be tzaddikim really. What I mean, we are all nivroim. We were all created with chukim. We were all created with specific restrictions and boundaries on our distance. Everything in the world has a chok and a teva. We cannot exceed our boundaries. But the Baruch Shem, because of his yichud, because he's Eino Mavadoi, he is everything. He has no boundaries. So the Baruch can be poiled with a mitzvah hayichud, which is beyond din and it's beyond mishpat. And this is the Or Torah. So therefore, what we see is that the real way to understand Hanukkah, basically, is to understand Hanukkah as the interface between the Jews and the Yevonim. But to understand what that interface really was, we really have to look at the global picture of the Dalit Shibudim and the transformation of the mode of Shira throughout history between Nevuah and Chochmah, and then begin to understand what the whole Inyan of Hanukkah is.